To my melanated family and spiritually conscious brothers and sisters around the world. I am Brother Tommy. And it is time to get it in. One Love Family. This video is going to discuss white male domination and interracial sexual relations in colonial America. As colonial America established the legal traditions expanding the human rights of whites while simultaneously cutting back those of blacks, there was one subgroup of each being pulled several ways: colonial America's white and black women. At times the stratification became 1. White males, 2. White females, 3. Black females, 4. Black males. Always there was the purported concern for white racial integrity, but curiously both in practice and by legislation there was not equal concern about white male integrity. The legal process was tolerant of white male illicit escapades involving either white females or black females, but it was relatively harsh on infractions by white females, even when involving white males, and brutally harsh on interactions between black males and white females. The law's greater sensitivity to interracial sexual activity and white male domination remained for centuries. As recently as 1974, though in a somewhat different factual context, the United States Supreme Court stated that women in America have been the victims of either overt discrimination or a socialization process of a male-dominated culture. Even the famed egalitarian, Thomas Jefferson, purportedly believed that women should be neither seen nor heard in society's decision-making councils. The statutes that we study in this chapter were written by white males approximately 300 years ago. They exemplify the values, preferences, and standards of a socialization process of a white male-dominated culture. One should ascertain whether, by their language or their enforcement, the statutes were more advantageous to white males than to any other segment of society. The consequence of a white male-dominated culture has been inherent in the legal system. To this malaise must be added the additional factor of the law's different responses when interracial matters are involved. Interracial sexual relations seem to have been always an even more sensitive and, for some, threatening area than the normal concerns about sexual relations. There are many contradictions between the practices and the legal prohibitions on interracial sexual relations. As one views the varying complexions of blacks in America, it is quite obvious that there has been extensive interracial sexual relations despite the many purported taboos and legal pronouncements against it. Colonial anxiety about interracial sexual activity cannot be attributed solely to 17th century values, for it was not until 1967 that the United States Supreme Court finally declared unconstitutional those statutes prohibiting interracial marriages. The Supreme Court waited 13 years after its Brown decision dealing with desegregation of schools before, in Loving v. Virginia, it agreed to consider the issue of interracial marriages. Many commentators have suggested that the issue of interracial marriage was far more explosive than even the maelstrom involved over integrated education, and that it was by design that the court delayed accepting such cases until 1967. As recently as 1967, more than 16 states prohibited and punished interracial marriages, and in the celebrated Loving case the Virginia trial judge in January 1959 stated his legal rationale justifying the constitutionality of the prohibition against interracial marriages as follows. Almighty God created the races white, black, yellow, Malay and red, and he placed them on separate continents. And but for the interference with his arrangement there would be no cause for such marriages. The fact that he separated the races shows that he did not intend for the races to mix. Thus the colonial legal system can be better evaluated by recognizing that it was a system controlled by a white male-dominated culture, a society generally antagonistic toward blacks, a society wherein white males wanted to maintain their domination over both white and black females, and finally a society in which white males fervently desired to preclude any sexual relationships between black males and white females. The data indicates that almost from the time blacks arrived in Virginia there were interracial sexual relations between Indians, blacks, and whites. The fact that legislators thought it was necessary to pass statutes pertaining to interracial sexual practices demonstrates their perception that this was a special problem requiring specific statutory prohibitions. It is unclear whether prior to 1662 judicial punishments of miscegenation were merely the same punishments employed in all instances of fornication. For example, in the previously discussed Davis case the punishment may have been solely for disobeying moral doctrine, rather than for crossing the color line. Court records show that prior to 1662, all fornicators, regardless of race, were fined or whipped. In typical piecemeal fashion, the Virginia legislature attacked in 1662 one facet of a problem caused by illicit sexual behavior: the problem of women indentured servants, white or black, having children out of wedlock, they passed a statute that penalized the unmarried mother by requiring her to serve an additional 2 years. In the preamble, the legislature noted that some dissolute masters had gotten their maids with child in order to claim the benefit of their service, and that some loose women, hoping to gain their freedom, had laid all their bastards to their masters. And accordingly, the following provision was enacted. Each woman servant got with child by her master shall after her indenture is expired be sold for 2 years by the church wardens, the tobacco to be employed by the vestry for the use of the parish. Note the bias in favor of males in this statute. While conception of a child required a male's involvement and while often the father may even have been the master of the mother, it was the mother only who had the additional burden of servitude. Furthermore, the psychological forces affecting the female indentured servant may raise the question as to how voluntary her act was, if it involved the master. Yet, the master or male's act was clearly voluntary, and he was at least equally culpable. Nevertheless, the male had no additional penal burden. The society economically profited by obtaining a servant for 2 years without cost for her labor. The child of the union suffered the social stigmatization of being a bastard. But in a struggling colony where the population was largely composed of Europe's undesirables and where women were scarce, it is unclear whether illegitimacy, per se, was so great a stigma. During the same year, however, the Colonial Assembly thought sexual relations between whites and blacks to be special problems requiring a special penalty. 1662. Act 12. Children got by an Englishman upon a Negro woman shall be bond or free according to the condition of the mother, and if any Christian shall commit fornication with a Negro man or woman, he shall pay double the fines of a former act. This statute, upon first reading, does not clearly reveal the built-in bias and preferences of its drafters. Englishman is used here as probably a synonym for whites generally or at least white Englishmen. The fact that interracial fornication caused a double fine corroborates the thesis that an interracial sexual act was considered to be far more immoral or deviant than fornication by persons of the same race. The statute also expressed more than mere social taboos or religious precepts. Implicit in the statute were the economic preferences and advantages to whites who sought to extend servitude and slavery. Prior to passage of this statute, it had been an open question as to whether the normal doctrine of English law would be applicable, that the status of a child would be dependent upon the status of the child's father. However, the statute rejected the English doctrine and provided that children got by an Englishman upon a Negro woman shall be bond or free according to the condition of the mother. Because, at least in part, of the scarcity of white women, there was probably far more sexual contact between Englishmen and black women than between white women and black men. It was, therefore, significant from an economic standpoint whether a child derived its status from its mother or its father. Once it was established that the black woman's child took the mother's status, the master class gained a crucial economic advantage: its labor force reproduced itself. If the legislature had followed the English legal doctrine that the status of the child was determined by the status of the father, the thousands of blacks, or mulattoes whose fathers were white would have been free. However, contrary to English precedent, the legislators adopted the doctrine which would maximize their privileges. Thus, even the children whose fathers were their mother's white masters were not only bastards, but slaves. By his illicit relations, a white male could eliminate the cost of purchasing an infant slave, by agreeing to enslave his progeny. He became a breeder of slaves. The subsequent 1691 statute was far more comprehensive. By the language of its preamble, it was designed to prevent that abominable mixture and spurious issue by Negroes, mulattoes and Indians intermarrying with English or other white women, and provided that whatsoever English or other white man or woman, bond or free, shall intermarry with a Negro, mulatto, or Indian man or woman, bond or free, he shall within 3 months be banished from this dominion forever. And it is further enacted, that if any English woman being free shall have a bastard child by a Negro, she shall pay £15 to the church wardens, and in default of such payment, she shall be taken into possession by the church wardens and disposed of for 5 years, and the amount she brings shall be paid 1/3 to their majesties for the support of the government, 1/3 to the of the parish where the offense is committed, and the other third to the informer. The child shall be bound out by the church wardens until he is 30 years of age. In case the English woman that shall have a bastard is a servant, she shall be sold by the church wardens, after her time is expired, for 5 years, and the child serve as aforesaid. Several racial disparities were written into this statute. After 1691, the white man or woman was to be penalized if he or she legitimized the relationship with a black person by marriage. In that event they would be banished from the colony forever. Yet, apparently the white man could remain in the colony if he merely carried on a meretricious relationship with a black woman. The possibility of pregnancy significantly lessened the white woman's chances of maintaining a clandestine relationship with a black man. Yet, the statute did not penalize a white man for having sexual relations with his slave, and it was not a crime for a black woman to have a bastard child by a white man. Both acts became a crime only when a white Englishwoman had a black man's child out of wedlock. By 1705, the Virginia General Assembly had clarified all ambiguities and ensured that all mulatto children would be servants at least until they were 31 years old. The statute also provided harsher punishment for an unwed mother. A woman servant who had an illegitimate child by a black or a mulatto was fined £15. If she was unable to pay the fine, she was sold for 5 years at the expiration of her time of service. If the unwed mother was a free white woman, she was also subject to a £15 fine or 5 years of service. In one major aspect of interracial relationships, the 1705 statute mirrored those legislative enactments that preceded it. The harshest punishment was levied against those interracial couples sought to legalize their relationships. Banishment, the penalty imposed by the 1691 Act, was so ineffective a deterrent that sterner measures were enacted by the General Assembly. The statute required any white master or mistress, having a Christian white servant, who married a black, mulatto, Indian, or a non-Christian, to free the servant. In addition, the statute authorized a fine and imprisonment. Whatsoever white man or woman being free shall intermarry with a Negro shall be committed to prison for 6 months without bail and pay £10 to the use of the parish. Ministers marrying such persons shall pay £10,000 of tobacco. The 1705 prohibition against interracial marriage was reenacted in 1792. Both statutes imposed a penalty of 6 months imprisonment on whites, but curiously at that time no imprisonment penalty was imposed on blacks in the statutes. In 1848 the imprisonment for whites marrying blacks was increased to 12 months. It was not until 1932, when the statute was amended, that imprisonment was imposed on both blacks and whites for intermarrying, and in 1932 the penalty was increased to confinement in the penitentiary for from 1 to 5 years. Occasionally the legislature annulled a marriage between whites or granted a divorce on the ground that the white female had had sexual relations with a slave or a free black man. The marriage between Benjamin Butt Jr. and a certain Lydia Bright, who is of respectable family, and was at the time of the marriage supposed to be unsullied in her reputation, is dissolved because Lydia has been delivered of a mulatto child and has publicly acknowledged that the father of the child is a slave. Chapter 223. A marriage solemnized between Richard Jones, of the county of Northampton, and his wife, Peggy, is dissolved and Richard forever divorced from Peggy provided that a jury find that the child of Peggy is not the child of Richard, but is the offspring of a man of color. When white males impregnated black women, during the time when the above statutes were passed, no statutory annulments or divorces were granted. But the 1705 and 1792 Acts did more than proscribe interracial relationships. The statutes minimized the economic options available to blacks, mulattoes, Indians, and non-Christians. All non-whites were prohibited from obtaining white servants. Such legislation clearly limited freed blacks, Indians, and mulattoes from gaining a foothold in the colony's economy because purchasing a slave required more initial capital investment than securing the services of an indentured servant. With these rigid statutory restrictions written by white males, might think that interracial sexual relationships during the colonial period would have become non-existent. Instead, the statutes merely eliminated legitimization of marriages and encouraged the extensive exploitation of black women by their masters and other white men, thus explaining the presence of thousands of mulattoes in Virginia. The result was that there was probably more intermixture in the 1700s than since then. Despite moral taboos and criminal sanctions, white men of every social rank slept with Negro women. The colonists, as well as European travelers in the colonies, frequently pointed to this facet of American life. Where interracial sex relations were involved, the legal system was Operation Ally effective to the extent that white men maximized their options, dehumanized blacks, white women and themselves. Thank you for tuning into the Melanated Roots channel. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Until the next video. Peace.